Breaking news, President Vladimir Putin says Russia will conduct a military operation in Ukraine. We're now joining an ABC News special report in progress.
As you say, it looks like the darkest day has come to pass following this speech by Vladimir Putin. We decided to launch this special military operation, calling on the Ukrainian military to lay down its arms, talking about the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. I mean, judging by those words, this appears to be the worst case scenario. Potentially, we have to wait and see. Not just forces moving into the east to these rebel-held areas, but potentially moving on other parts of the country. This seems to be a much larger ambition. It's no longer just about the Donbass, this industrial heartland in the east of the country. It doesn't really seem to be just about Ukraine per se. He again warned foreign countries not to interfere. He talked about NATO expansionism. And I think there you have it, really, what Vladimir Putin is really concerned about restoring the might of Russia at the expense of the people of Ukraine. The Ukrainian president has spoken 3 times over the last 3 nights. He's been very clear that he will not leave the capital, Kiev, despite being instructed to do so by the Americans, or suggested that he do so by the Americans, that he and the people will stand and fight. And that's what we've been hearing from the Ukrainian military and from people who were called up in the last few hours. They've gone from being civilians to now being soldiers having to fight on the front line. We have to wait and see what targets were struck here in Kiev. There have been reports of explosions in other areas. You know, what is the military objective here?
Stick with us here, Ian, because I'm getting word that we have some of what you've heard in the last couple of minutes here in Kiev. Let's listen. Obviously, for any one of us who have covered conflict in the past, the distinct sound of bombs going off in the distance. And Ian, I want to bring you back in because we were talking about the Donbass and eastern Ukraine, these 2 separatist regions that are part of the Donbass region. That's quite a ways from where you are in Kiev, and so to hear these explosions where you are in Kiev obviously leads to this larger question about how big the size and scope of this operation.
Yes, absolutely, and that would be critical in terms of its bigger impact. I mean, in any case, whatever the scale of the military invasion that is now clearly underway, because President Putin has just announced it, is going to be devastating for this country. But if it is that larger invasion from Crimea in the south, this part of Ukraine that Russia annexed in 2014, and also from the east, again from the Russian city of Belgrade, its forces who gathered there, we felt that potentially they could move across into the east of the country, into the Donbass from there. And I think most worrying for the citizens of the capital from Belarus to the north, which is really only about 2 or 3 hours drive from the capital. That's unimpeded driving, of course. To get here, then that would be truly devastating. I mean, this is a large country, the largest country in Europe. You know, all the warnings have been that you would see large numbers of casualties, large numbers of refugees.
For those of you watching, Ian, thank you, and stay with us here. We'll certainly come back to you. For those of you watching, Vladimir Putin has just declared to the Russian people that a special military operation is now underway. He urged members of the Ukrainian forces to lay down their arms. He told other countries not to interfere. This Russian military operation that U.S. authorities in the West had warned was coming is now, in fact, underway. I want to bring in our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, also reporting in. She's in Lviv, Ukraine tonight. And Martha, what are you learning from your sources?
Well, I have just been told, and it's quite obvious at this point, that it has indeed started. A senior Pentagon official told me that just a short time ago. This is the same Pentagon official who several hours ago texted me, David, I know I've shared it with all of you, and said you are likely in the last few hours of peace on the European continent for a long time to come, adding a warning, be careful. Here in Lviv, we have not heard any sounds of any sort of strikes. We are on the border with Poland, about 50 miles from Poland here in the west, but certainly on alert for any type of action. I've also been told by other senior officials that there are Russian teams out throughout Ukraine looking for people. This is the playbook that the United States has given intelligence about over the past few weeks, how this would go down, that it would start with cyber attacks. We are hearing there are cyber attacks already beginning in Ukraine. Then we would have missile strikes, aerial strikes, and Russian troops moving forward. Again, we don't know exactly where those Russian troops will go, what they will do, how or when or if they will attack Kiev, but it is something we're standing by for at the moment, David. Again, no sounds here yet of any sort of action, but we are braced for that.
Martha, you've been on the ground in Ukraine for several days now, and we have witnessed an extraordinary change in the temperature from the leadership of Ukraine just in the last couple of hours. The president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, addressing the Ukrainian people, actually revealing that he tried to reach out, tried to call Vladimir Putin today, that Putin did not take the call. And after days of saying his country should remain united, tonight, he addressed the Russian people directly, saying, we do not want war, saying that the Russians have been watching a Ukraine that is not the real Ukraine, that the message from Putin that they're going to free Ukrainians, he said, we are a free people.
And he was met with silence, he said, when he tried to reach out to Vladimir Putin. Of course, President Zelensky several weeks ago and a week ago, really, was trying to tell people not to panic, that he didn't believe there was an invasion, so it really is a marked difference tonight. The U.S. has been trying to get President Zelensky to leave for his own safety. He obviously has not and is determined to stay, but that impassioned plea tells it all. He knows what's happening here tonight. He knows what is to come, a devastating war on the European continent, David.
Martha Raddatz, stay with us here as you have for many days now. I should mention that Secretary of State Antony Blinken told me earlier this evening that this orchestrated series of events, this request for Russian military help is exactly what the U.S. had predicted, telling me in the last 24 to 48 hours or so, Russia had been putting the final touches together to be ready for a full-scale invasion. And tonight, Ukraine's leader has put the country under a state of emergency in addition to that message, not only to the people of Ukraine, but as Martha and I were just talking about, to the people of Russia, saying what your leader, meaning Vladimir Putin, obviously what he's been telling you, how he has been describing Ukraine, is not the reality on the ground. I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, because we know President Biden is watching these developments, the Biden administration. And Cecilia, you heard Secretary Blinken tell me earlier that they did in fact believe this was imminent. There were more sanctions today related to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline after those harsh sanctions last night. And of course, the big question now is how President Biden will respond.
How and when, David, that is exactly right. We are waiting word from the president. We had been told by the White House earlier today that when they did believe this was a question of when this invasion would actually occur, that we would hear from the White House, from the president personally at some point after the fact. We do have a statement, a tweet from the press secretary, Jen Psaki. She says that the president is closely right now monitoring these developments there in Ukraine, that he's going to be receiving regular updates from his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan. He also just spoke with his UN ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield, before she addressed the United Nations General Security Council meeting, that emergency meeting, that remarkable split screen of these diplomats imploring directly Vladimir Putin to not go through with this. The UN Secretary General looking directly in the camera and speaking to Putin, saying, please, the world is asking you to not do this, while Putin was on the split screen there in Moscow, basically declaring war right now. We are still waiting, as we said, to hear from the president, David, but you have mentioned it. This White House repeatedly in the lead up to this has promised swift and severe sanctions if Vladimir Putin decided to go through with this. Now we wait. The ball had been in Vladimir Putin's court. He decided to make this move, and now we wait to see what this White House does with that.
One thing the White House has been very clear about for many weeks now, Cecilia, is the fact that U.S. troops will not be sent into Ukraine. In fact, Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, reiterating that again today, saying we have no plans to be at war with Russia or putting any military troops on the ground in Ukraine to fight Russia, as we continue to hear more explosions in the background there in Kiev, Cecilia.
That is a point, David, that this White House wants and needs the American public to know. They have no intention, the press secretary said today, that the president does not have and will not decide under any circumstance to send American troops on the ground across the border into Ukraine. There are thousands of troops there on an assist level in the region. They do not, the White House says they will not cross over into this conflict. The president himself made a very eerie comment. He said, if you see American troops in combat with Russian soldiers, that would be blood. That would mean World War III. He has no intention of doing that. He has made that clear. And David, we talked about those polls. This is not what Americans want to see. They want minimal engagement in this conflict there.
Cecilia Vega standing by in Washington following the Biden administration and any potential response we might get from President Biden tonight or in the coming hours to what we're seeing playing out. I do want to ask the control room if we have that video, because we are beginning to hear a series of explosions. We took a moment to hear it earlier. I just wanted to play for you some of what they're hearing in Ukraine now, a few hours before the sun comes up. It is 5:23 in the morning in Ukraine. The sun has not come up. We had been told by senior defense officials with the U.S. that likely this operation would begin under the cover of darkness. We'd also been told that they are expecting some difficult weather in the coming days and that likely Vladimir Putin would move in this particular time period, given the weather conditions on the ground, and before sunrise allows them to get this operation started before the Ukrainian people have a chance to recognize what's playing out in their own country. We do know that Western journalists in Kharkiv, now this is a city, it's the second largest city in Ukraine, it's north of the Donbass region, that they are also hearing explosions there as well. And so we have Ian Panel in Kiev, of course the capital of Ukraine, where they're hearing explosions in Kharkiv, and you can see it on the map there. If you look just off to the right, you can see the Donbass, those two regions that were declared, suddenly declared independent by Vladimir Putin in the last couple of days. Those are in that area right there. It was suspected that it was most likely that Russian troops that had amassed along the border, 150,000 troops or so in the north, the east, and the south, but there in the east, that they would enter the Donbass region. The big question was whether or not this operation would be much larger than that. The fact that you're hearing explosions in Kiev, and again, just north of that region, you can see it there on the map, Kharkiv, would signal that this operation is a large one. We don't know if it's as large as U.S. authorities had feared, but it is certainly much larger than just simply entering the Donbass from the east. I should mention that we've also learned tonight that civilian flights over Ukraine have been restricted, particularly over northeastern Ukraine there. This is believed the restriction came after a warning from Russia to flights entering these areas that they do so at their own risk. We also know that a no-fly notice had been issued for the Kharkiv airport. That's the city just to the north of the Donbass, where I said they're hearing explosions as well at this hour. As I mentioned, the second largest city in Ukraine, after the Ukrainian military reported Russia may target Kharkiv in an attack. And in fact, tonight these explosions would signal that, in fact, is the case. You heard Martha mention earlier that U.S. authorities had urged President Zelensky to leave Kyiv, but in addressing the Ukrainian people, he made it very clear that he was staying put, at least for now. James Longman, our foreign correspondent in Moscow, listening to Vladimir Putin these last couple of days, his address to the Russian people, making the case for moving in, declaring those two separatist regions independent. And James, Vladimir Putin coming back on television in Russia just tonight, declaring a special military operation now underway. And he told Ukrainians to lay down their arms.
That's right, David. And I think the choreography of this was really rather extraordinary. The timing of this message, just as the United Nations Security Council was meeting, and actually just as the gavel went down after the Russians stopped speaking, we heard those explosions in Kiev. They know how to send a message. This is about undermining international cooperation. That is what Vladimir Putin has sought to do for years. And he's done that because he wants to divide his enemies in order that he can carry out his objectives. And we heard in that statement he gave earlier today, that word denazification, a loaded comment there. Very similar to the words he's been using around what he believes to be happening down in the eastern part of Ukraine. This word genocide, he's used it time and time again. This is about appealing to his people, to say to them, this is not an offensive war, this is a defensive war. We are saving people in the Donbass. And he's warned off other foreign elements. He's saying to the rest of the world, don't come anywhere near us because we are in the process of saving the people of eastern Ukraine. Obviously, these comments bear no relation to what is actually happening in that country, but this was a message squarely for his own people. We just heard President Zelensky in Ukraine appeal to the Russian people. Well, Putin has done the same to his own people now, and we'll just have to see just how far he wants to go into the country. He said he doesn't want to occupy the Ukrainian territory. That was one of the quotes from the speech he gave. Quite what he believes that to mean, we will wait and see, because of course he doesn't really believe that Ukraine should exist. He would deny that if you asked him, but from what he's been saying all week, that speech he gave earlier this week, very, very clear that he believes in rebuilding some kind of Russian empire. And if you just look at what's been going on in this country and the region over the last 10 to 15 years, this is very much part of a path, a trajectory that he has been on. In 2008, the war in Georgia, where again he sought to move the Russian military into an area that he had declared independent. The annexation of Crimea. This is part of Vladimir Putin's playbook. Is he the cold, calculated KGB former profiler, or is he a man bent on achieving his true objective, which is to rebuild the Russian Empire? Could he be both of those things? It was a very, very scary speech, David.
Just an extraordinary split screen playing out on the world stage. The reality that Vladimir Putin is trying to present to the Russian people versus what the West has signaled to the world for several weeks now about Vladimir Putin's plans in Ukraine. I should mention we're hearing sirens now going off in Kiev, of course, the capital of Ukraine, in addition to bombs, explosions off in the distance, both in Kiev and in Kharkiv, which is north of the Donbass region. All of that playing out at this hour. We also are aware of this emergency meeting at the United Nations. You can hear the explosions there in the distance. The UN Security Council meeting at this hour, and the U.S. ambassador to the UN had already told the UN General Assembly just today that Vladimir Putin has asked the world to travel back in time by more than 100 years to an age of empires. And Martha Raddatz back with us tonight. And Martha, I am just struck that what authorities here in the U.S. had warned would happen, the sequence of events that they prepared the American people for, and much of the world for that matter, have begun to play out in exactly the sequence that they had predicted.
It certainly has, David, and the administration kept saying, I hope we are wrong. I hope this invasion does not happen, but it appears clearly they were right. It's happening. You know, David, we were walking around the city today, and people were out. Right now, the city is dark. People will be waking up to this. I'm sure word is starting to spread about what's happening, and they'll wake up to see their nightmare, that their country has been invaded by the Russians. There was an absolute sense of disbelief here for many days, but it is indeed a reality right now.
And it's one that they'll continue to wake up as the sun comes up over Ukraine. And as you mentioned, Martha, to learn that the Russians are attacking their country. And let's bring in retired Colonel Stephen Ganyard, who's standing by with us tonight. And Stephen, you and I have talked for days here about the potential for this full-scale invasion and what that might look like, and whether or not it would expand beyond the Donbass. And just the fact that our reporter in Kiev, Ian Pannell, is hearing explosions, that Western journalists in Kharkiv are also reporting explosions, in addition to those troops that had already amassed along the Donbass. So talk us through what you think could be playing out at this hour.
Yeah, David, as you mentioned, you and I have been talking about this buildup, this massive buildup on 3 sides of Ukraine. What's not on the map are the 20 ships down here that are capable of an amphibious landing. We know that the Russians have over 400 Iskander surface-to-surface missiles arrayed around the country to cover 95% of this country. So the initial strikes that we think we're hearing right now, right out of the Russian playbook, would be cruise missiles to take out things like surface-to-air missile systems, air defense systems that the Ukrainians would have. That would clear the path for waves of bombers and attack aircraft to continue to hit things like power plants, command and control, internet command centers. So the whole idea here in these first hours will be to create confusion, to separate the government from its people, to separate the government from their military, and to create the confusion that they hope will allow them to begin a ground invasion. That's what's anticipated. Where that comes and when is the question, and it will probably take us hours to see what happens and what Mr. Putin's true goal is in a ground invasion.
Steve Gandard with us, tracking the potential scenarios that we could watch play out in the coming hours. We're just learning that there's a statement coming in from the White House. Let's go back to Cecilia for that. Cecilia?
David, the president is saying that, of course, he is praying for the people of Ukraine tonight, but perhaps he is really pointing this directly at Vladimir Putin. President Putin, quote, has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction this attack will bring, and the United States and its allies and partners will respond in a united and decisive way. The world will hold Russia accountable. David, he will be meeting with G7 allies in the morning. He says that he will be speaking to the American people to announce further consequences. And that, of course, is those sanctions, what the White House has been describing, some of the most severe sanctions ever levied. We expect to hear from the White House tomorrow. David.
Cecilia, thank you. Again, you're watching ABC News live coverage of what Russia is calling a special military operation, what U.S. authorities in the West will likely call an invasion, and a full-scale invasion was what they had been warning of all day, saying it was imminent given the intelligence on the ground. Vladimir Putin announcing that this military operation, claiming it's intended to protect civilians. But before we go off the air for now, I did want to check back in with Ian Pannell, our chief foreign correspondent there in Kiev. And Ian, given the juxtaposition of Putin's words intended to protect civilians, I'm struck by what we heard from the Pentagon today, saying if he decides to conduct this invasion, this will be a war of choice and it won't be bloodless.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a dark day for Ukraine and it's a dark day for Europe. We're potentially now looking at the first conflict between 2 sovereign nation armies in Europe since the end of the Second World War. I think Ukrainians will start to wake up. They'll be hearing the news. They'll be hearing the explosions. Since we've been on air, we've heard at least 3 more distinct large explosions in the night sky here in Kiev. It's not possible to know exactly what's caused them or indeed what the targets are. But of course, against the backdrop of this effective declaration of war by Vladimir Putin, one would imagine that it could potentially be some kind of Russian airstrike, but it's a dark day for the country and people will wake in a climate of fear. David.
Just an extraordinary scene that the people of Ukraine will wake up to. We can hear the sirens going off behind you. Our thanks to you, Ian. Again, Vladimir Putin declaring a special military operation, what the West is calling an invasion tonight of Ukraine. Putin warning other countries that any attempt to interfere with this Russian action would lead to, quote, consequences they have never seen.